England, 19th century. The streets were lit by the flickering glow of gas lamps, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoing through narrow cobblestone alleys, and black smoke rising from factory chimneys blanketing the sky. Majestic palaces and opulent balls showcased the lives of the wealthy elite. Yet, just a few streets away, millions of people struggled with hunger, poverty, and despair in damp basements. And hidden in the shadow of this glittering world was a truth that no one dared speak aloud, a reality most history books avoided. Some men sold their wives due to debt and societal pressure. Women were treated as commodities, traded for the economic and social benefit of their families. This dark secret revealed the most frightening side of the era's hidden economy and social structure. Victorian England witnessed some of history's most rapid social and economic transformations. With Queen Victoria ascending the throne in 1837, the Industrial Revolution swept across the country, reshaping cities with factories, ports, and railway networks. This transformation brought immense wealth and opportunities for some, while for millions it meant destitution and hunger. Factories thrived on the labor of workers and children alike. Children operated heavy machinery with small hands, and men and women endured deadly working conditions all day long. Injuries, illnesses, and deaths were part of everyday life. In such an environment, the responsibility on men to protect and provide for their families became an overwhelming burden. For middle and upper-class families, the situation was no less rigid. Social status, prestige, and reputation dictated the future of a family. Men wielded economic power and influence, while women's lives were largely confined to household chores and child-rearing. Their access to education was limited, their participation in the workforce rare. Economic independence was nearly non-existent, and the ability to make choices about their own lives was severely restricted. Marriage, especially among the middle and upper classes, was more an economic and social contract than a matter of love. A girl could be married off to another family to settle debts or increase her own family's wealth. For men, marriage was about maintaining family honor and social standing rather than personal affection. As a result, women's consent was often disregarded. Cities were the stage for these pressures. London's aristocratic mansions and lavish balls symbolized social prestige and wealth, while backstreets housed families fighting hunger and disease. Children were sent to factories, women had little freedom outside marriage or domestic service, and social class differences permeated every aspect of life. This contradictory and oppressive world created the conditions for men to make horrifying decisions, such as selling their wives. Archives and court records reveal how this dark tradition operated. In 1840s Lancashire, a merchant gave his 17-year-old wife to another family to pay off debts. Another family transferred their young wife to an aristocratic household due to financial crisis. These cases stand as chilling examples of the era's economic and social realities. Economic and social pressures on men pushed them toward ethically questionable and morally horrific decisions. In trying to protect their prestige and families, the darkest consequence was that some women changed hands as wives. This practice continued quietly, not only among lower-class families, but also within middle and upper-class households. The suffering of these women was often overlooked by society and history. To truly understand this dark side of the Victorian era, one must examine not only the economic and social frameworks, but also individual psychology, family decision-making, and women's helplessness. Every marriage arrangement or wife sale was not merely an economic transaction. It was a complete disregard for a person's life, freedom, and dreams. During the Victorian era, women, especially in lower and middle-class families, were often treated as property, valued not for their individuality, but for their family's economic and social interests. A woman's worth was largely determined by her beauty, her family's wealth, and social standing. Educational opportunities were extremely limited. Only a small number of women were literate, and higher academic education was virtually impossible. Participation in the workforce was almost non-existent, and the chance to exercise autonomy over one's own life was minimal. Families viewed their daughters as economic tools. A family in debt could give a daughter to another household in exchange for a good marriage. This practice was not confined to the lower classes. It was also common among the middle and upper classes. Wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and families seeking to preserve social status would, under financial pressure or during crises, essentially transfer young women to other families. Courts often prioritized the interests of families over the consent of the women involved. Contemporary newspapers reveal how such practices were quietly accepted by society. For instance, in the 1850s, records show that an English merchant transferred his 16-year-old wife to another family to settle debts. This event did not provoke public scandal. It appeared merely as sensational news in a few newspaper pages. Women, meanwhile, were largely powerless against their fate, and the trauma and psychological pressure they endured remained hidden for years. Viewing women as property reduced their lives to economic calculations. Marriage became an agreement that determined a woman's life, freedom, and dreams, imposing enormous psychological strain. Diaries and letters from the period vividly document this pressure. A young girl forced to marry into another family to settle her parents' debts was not only experiencing a personal tragedy, but also reflecting the broader social and economic injustices of the time. The legal and economic restrictions on women made them entirely dependent on men and their families' decisions. Women had little to no personal wealth, limited inheritance rights, and virtually no possibility of living independently. Consequently, a man Deschamps' decision to give his wife to another family in order to preserve his family's prestige and status could be normalized within the societal and legal structures of the era. The psychological pressure, helplessness, and fear experienced by women not only caused individual trauma, but also reveal how deeply patriarchal structures and gender inequality were entrenched in society. Young girls had almost no say over their own futures. Their lives were dictated by their families' financial interests, effectively denying them freedom and personal value as human beings. Court records from the period show that a woman's consent was rarely sought. A family in debt could transfer a young girl to a wealthy household in exchange for marriage without challenge or scrutiny from the majority of society. Women's helplessness remained a silent story throughout history, but contemporary documents expose the existence of this dark tradition. Understanding this dark side of the Victorian era is crucial to comprehending the desperation women faced and the injustices embedded in society. Every marriage arrangement, every forced connection, represented the stripping away of a woman's life and freedom. Women were treated as commodities directed by the economic and social interests of families and men, completely losing control over their own lives. This situation did not merely create individual tragedies, it also shaped society's perception of women and the functioning of the social order. Women being treated as property, valued primarily for family wealth and beauty, illustrates how the cultural and economic structures of the time were deeply intertwined. In this context, men selling their wives was not simply an economic decision. It stood as one of the darkest and most disturbing reflections of the era's patriarchal society. Behind some men being forced to sell their wives during the Victorian era were not only economic crises or debts, but also far more complex social and psychological factors. The structure of society placed an immense burden on men to protect their families, maintain their prestige, and remain economically afloat. These pressures sometimes drove them to make decisions that crossed ethical and human boundaries. Economic reasons were paramount. The rapid pace of industrialization, the opening of new factories, and the growth of cities created enormous opportunities for wealth. but also brought economic crises, debt traps, and investment failures. When a merchant could no longer pay his debts, he sought radical solutions to keep his family afloat and preserve his social standing. One such solution was to transfer a young and valuable wife to another family. For example, records from 1840s Lancashire document a merchant giving his 17-year-old wife to another household to settle debts. Such practices were often viewed as an economic lifeline for men. Social pressures were another significant factor pushing men toward these dark decisions. Victorian society expected men to maintain family prestige and social status. A man's reputation was measured not only by his personal achievements, but also by his marriages and family connections. A man facing financial ruin or diminished honor often felt compelled under social pressure to do whatever it took to save his family, even if it meant considering ethically unacceptable options like selling his wife. Psychological factors were equally important. The economic and social pressures created immense stress and anxiety. The burden of keeping the family afloat, paying off debts, and preserving prestige often became unbearable. Under such strain, making morally troubling decisions sometimes seemed like the only solution. Historical documents reveal the psychological conflicts and inner fears these men experienced when making such choices. Legal and societal norms also made it easier for men to take these actions. Women's rights were extremely limited. Inheritance rights were restricted, and their ability to control their own lives was almost non-existent. Courts and society often prioritized protecting men's economic and social interests. As a result, marriages or sales carried out without a woman's consent could become normalized within the social framework of the time. Another reason men sold their wives was tied to strategic family considerations. In some households, young women were selected to be given to other families for economic or political advantage. Such marriages strengthened social alliances, alleviated financial crises, and enhanced family prestige. Women remained completely passive in this process, with their own lives and desires ignored. For instance, period documents tell the story of a man who gave his wife to another family to save his household from bankruptcy. This decision was rarely questioned by society, and in some cases, was even met with a measure of respect. Women, meanwhile, were treated like commodities, transferred without their consent. This tragedy was not merely an individual occurrence, but a direct outcome of the social, economic, and cultural structures of the time. In conclusion, the reasons men sold their wives in Victorian England were multifaceted. Economic crises, debt pressure, social prestige, psychological stress, legal loopholes, and family strategy all converged. This dark and tragic reality stands as one of the most striking and disturbing reflections of the era, social structure, patriarchal system, and economic order. The helplessness of women and the horrifying decisions forced upon men under pressure represent the unforgettable and painful face of the Victorian era. In the Victorian era, the sale or transfer of wives to another family was not merely an individual decision. It operated within a structured mechanism and under a framework of societal approval. The process involved families, intermediaries, and the tacit consent of certain segments of society. Women had almost no voice. Every step was planned by men prioritizing economic and social interests. The first stage usually began with economic necessity. Families drowning in debt sought radical solutions to protect their property and prestige. A young woman's value was calculated based on her beauty, her family's wealth, and social status, forming the basis for any agreement with another family. Intermediaries, such as lawyers, merchants, or family friends, organized these marriages, handling negotiations and contracts. A woman's consent was largely ignored. She became merely an instrument serving the family's interests. Societal approval was one of the most striking aspects of this process. Men felt justified in making this horrific decision when acting according to society's expectations. A family could settle its debts, maintain social standing, and appear to have taken a difficult but necessary step in the eyes of their community. Meanwhile, the trauma and psychological pressure experienced by women were ignored. Newspapers rarely reported on these events, and when they did, coverage was often sensational and minimal. In this way, societal norms emboldened men while completely silencing women's voices. Another dimension of this sale mechanism was strategic family relationships. Some marriages were arranged not merely to settle debts, but to gain political or social advantages. By giving a daughter to a wealthy merchant or the son of a prestigious aristocrat, a family could strengthen economic and social ties, reduce debts, or enhance prestige. Historical documents, marriage contracts, letters, and court records clearly illustrate how young women's lives became matters of negotiation. The psychological trauma women endured in this process often remained hidden. Even if a young girl wished to oppose her family's decision, social pressure and economic dependence left her powerless. She lived under immense fear and helplessness, as living independently or outside marriage was nearly impossible. This made women entirely subject to the control of men and their families. Legally, the situation also worked against women. With limited property rights, women were defenseless against marriage contracts and agreements. Courts often prioritized protecting men's economic interests over the consent of the woman involved. As a result, transferring a woman to another family could even be considered legally legitimate. Historical records provide detailed accounts of this process. For example, in 1845, a middle-class family transferred their daughter to another household in exchange for settling debts. The documents contained no mention of the girl's feelings, only details of the debt, prestige, and terms of the agreement. Women had effectively become property, exchanged like assets. Societal approval and legal legitimacy made it easier for men to make such horrific decisions. Even if a family experienced moral conflict, societal expectations and legal structures encouraged them to act. The suffering of women was seen as a negligible detail. What mattered was the prestige of men, the family's economic standing, and social status. In conclusion, the process of selling wives was not a matter of individual choice, but a complex mechanism combining economic necessity, social pressure, family strategy, and legal loopholes. Women remained entirely passive in this process, their lives and freedom disregarded for the sake of family interests. This dark and tragic aspect of the Victorian era represents one of the most disturbing features of its social structure. During the Victorian era, when women were turned into property for the economic and social interests of their families, the trauma and helplessness they experienced often remained invisible. The period's documents, diaries, and letters clearly reveal how women, us lives, became subjects of negotiation and the profound psychological impact this had. Many young girls were forced against their will to be given to another family in exchange for marriage, losing control over their own lives. Women's experiences were not merely the result of economic or social coercion, they also involved deep psychological pressure. Young girls often felt helpless and alone, and challenging their families or society risked their survival, so many chose to remain silent. Diaries recount nights spent crying before weddings, girls worrying about their uncertain futures. They understood that their lives were entirely at the mercy of others, yet had no way to make their voices heard. Some women, however, attempted small acts of resistance. Escape attempts, defiant letters, and silent rebellions were all expressions of their desire for freedom. For instance, some young women tried to run away before their wedding day, while others sought legal loopholes to avoid signing on marriage contracts. These efforts were mostly unsuccessful, as family and societal pressure invariably brought them back under control. The trauma women endured was not solely psychological, it had physical and social dimensions as well. Being Given to another family meant severing ties with their social environment, friends, and support systems. Entering the home of a completely unfamiliar household was both physically and psychologically demanding. Women often felt unsafe even in their own homes, and in their new households they were compelled to obey, while simultaneously feeling like objects. Despite this, some women managed to carve out small moments of freedom. Diaries and letters show that women secretly met friends or took short walks to experience a sense of independence. Books, poetry, and hidden writings provided outlets for expressing their inner lives. This quiet resistance illustrates the struggle women undertook to preserve their psychological well-being and maintain their sense of identity. Court records and newspapers from the period also document attempts by women to resist. For example, a young woman refused to sign a marriage contract under family pressure and took her case to court. While courts mostly ruled in favor of the families, such acts reflected women's efforts to assert control over their own lives. Though rare, these instances of defiance became silent stories of heroism in the historical record. Women's resistance was not only a personal struggle, but also a sign of societal change and awareness. These quiet and covert acts of defiance became the small sparks that later laid the groundwork for feminist movements. Women pursued the right to have a say over their own lives through dangerous and difficult means for the era. In conclusion, the experiences and resistance of women in the Victorian era reveal the dark and oppressive social structure of the time. While women were left powerless in the face of economic and societal pressures, they also found subtle ways to resist, striving to protect their freedom and reclaim control over their lives. This chapter is not only a historical account, but also a dramatic testament to the human spirit's ability to resist even under severe oppression. In the Victorian era, the sale or transfer of women as wives to another family was not merely an economic or social phenomenon. It was also indirectly shaped by legal and religious structures. The laws of the time severely limited women's rights, placing them under the control of their families and husbands. Women had restricted property rights. Inheritance often passed to brothers or fathers, and women could only secure economic protection through marriage. These legal gaps made it easier for men to sell their wives. Marriage contracts were common documents in the courts of the period. These agreements focused on protecting the economic interests of families and rarely considered the woman's consent. While the legal transfer of a woman to another family could be questioned, societal norms and court rulings mostly favored men. Women had very limited rights to object, both socially and legally, which facilitated men's ability to make such horrific decisions. The religious perspective also played a significant role in the process. The Church viewed marriage as a sacred union. However, a woman's consent or emotional well-being was often secondary. The Church prioritized the family's reputation and social order, and economic interests or family strategies could be legitimized within religious norms. Some clergymen approved marriage requests from wealthy or prestigious families, conducting ceremonies without questioning the woman's consent. This combination of legal and religious structures left women almost entirely under the control of men and their families. Women, through legal loopholes and religious sanction, were effectively treated as property, their lives negotiated and traded for economic and social gain. This reflects a dark facet of the social and cultural fabric of the era. Historical records show that certain court decisions placed women in completely passive roles. For example, when a family in debt decided to transfer their young daughter to another household, courts often approved the arrangement. Women's objections had little legal impact, yet documents reveal that some resisted silently. Though individual, this quiet resistance represented a subtle protest against the patriarchal structure of the period. The interplay between religious institutions and the legal system not only facilitated men's ability to sell their wives, but also normalized the practice. Society rarely questioned this dark practice, and sometimes even regarded it with a degree of respect. The trauma and helplessness experienced by women were largely ignored. This framework intertwined the economic, social, and cultural threads of the era, highlighting the complex forces behind men's horrific decisions. In conclusion, legal and religious perspectives created a powerful framework that controlled women's lives in Victorian England. Women's freedom was severely limited, their rights curtailed, and their ability to determine their own futures nearly non-existent. Men, supported by economic, social, legal, and religious structures, were able to make the devastating decision to transfer their wives to other families. This exposes the dark and tragic reality of the period. In the Victorian era, while men selling their wives and women being treated as property was largely met with silent social acceptance, scandals and controversies occasionally arose. Newspapers, particularly in major cities, sensationalized extraordinary cases and incidents that caught public attention, often sparked social outrage. These scandals highlighted not only individual tragedies, but also the distortions within the period's social and cultural structures. For example, in 1843 in Lancashire, a young woman was transferred by her family to another household to settle debts, quickly becoming the subject of citywide gossip. Newspapers reported the case in a sensational manner. Some readers condemned the family, while others sympathized with the indebted household. The event revealed society's divided stance. On one side were moral and ethical reactions, and on the other, economic and social pragmatism. Public reactions were largely shaped by class divisions. The working and lower classes generally responded with outrage, as they were familiar with similar economic pressures and helplessness. Meanwhile, the middle and upper classes tolerated and, in some cases, supported these practices to preserve financial interests and social prestige. This contradiction illustrated the rigid and hierarchical nature of Victorian society. The press played a significant role as well. Newspapers often presented these events in a sensational style, dramatizing them to attract readers' attention. However, the trauma and helplessness experienced by women were usually secondary. Women were often portrayed as silent victims, while men's decisions and family prestige were emphasized. This reflected limited social awareness and the marginalization of women's rights. Some intellectuals and thinkers criticized these practices. Advocates of women's rights highlighted how young girls and women were systematically deprived of freedom, their lives reduced to bargaining chips under economic and social pressures. Their writings argued that such decisions made for family interests were unacceptable both ethically and humanely. Yet these critiques were largely ignored or suppressed by much of society. Scandals sometimes triggered legal proceedings. Courts mostly ruled in favor of men when debts or family interests were involved, though in exceptional cases, women's resistance and social pressure could influence judicial outcomes. This demonstrated that the law was not entirely impartial, but shaped by social and economic power dynamics. Public reactions and scandals made the darker side of Victorian society more visible. Women's suffering was often balanced against economic and social interests, with ethical and moral considerations largely sidelined. This aspect of the era illuminates not only individual tragedies, but also social structures, class contradictions, and the flexibility of public morality. In conclusion, men selling their wives and women being treated as property during the Victorian period were surrounded by a complex web of social silence and contradiction. Scandals and public reactions occasionally sparked outrage, but economic interests and social prestige often overrode these concerns. This dark reality etched a forgotten and dramatic face of the Victorian era into history. In the Victorian era, women, treated almost as property under the pressures of their families and society, had to develop various strategies to survive and gain even a small measure of control over their own lives. These strategies often consisted of subtle yet clever maneuvers, sometimes silent disobedience, sometimes secret escapes, and sometimes diplomatic actions designed to bend societal rules to their advantage. Women had to remain constantly vigilant to protect their physical and psychological safety. At home, appearing obedient and complying with rules and expectations was often essential for survival. Yet, while outwardly conforming, many secretly kept diaries, wrote letters, or communicated with friends, methods to preserve their inner lives and maintain psychological resilience. Diaries often contained entries such as, "I take small steps for just a moment of freedom," reflecting their inner resistance and hope. Some women devised bolder strategies to pursue an independent life outside of marriage, escape attempts, secretly leaving the household, or delaying marriage contracts appear in historical records. For instance, in 1852, a young woman attempted to flee the city before her wedding day, gaining temporary freedom. Such efforts were risky, as capture could result in severe physical and psychological punishment. Survival strategies were not only physical, but also social and diplomatic. Some young women managed to establish influential relationships within their new households, protecting themselves and securing future independence. Gradually, they carved out small spheres of influence, creating opportunities to make their own decisions. These strategic actions allowed them to maintain an outwardly obedient demeanor while preserving inner freedom. Economic strategies also played a key role in survival. Women sought ways to increase independence through small-scale domestic production or earning income from household tasks. Sewing fabrics, selling small handicrafts, or taking on paid responsibilities within the household were small yet meaningful steps toward economic autonomy. These actions moved women out of complete passivity and improved their chances of survival. Developing psychological resilience was equally important. Women maintained emotional support networks through friends, relatives, or secret letters, sharing their trauma to stay strong. Such solidarity provided a source of hope and strength in the oppressive environment of the time. Taken together, these strategies reveal women's silent resistance and clever methods of survival. Each step represented a form of defiance against apparent helplessness. Each small action was an attempt to regain control over their own lives. Within the dark social structures of the Victorian era, these strategies enabled women to survive, preserve their identities, and sometimes achieve small victories. In conclusion, women's survival strategies were not merely individual acts, they represented quiet yet effective resistance against the patriarchal and oppressive social order of the time. These strategies encompassed psychological, physical, and social dimensions, illustrating women's persistent efforts to protect their freedom and dignity, even under harsh conditions. In the Victorian era, the practice of belle-buome, of selling women as wives and treating them as property, reflected not only the individual tragedies of the time, but also had a profound and lasting impact on societal structures and the struggle for women's rights. These dark practices were a chilling manifestation of a period in which women's freedoms and rights were severely restricted. Yet, the trauma and inequalities they endured laid the foundation for later social transformations and the feminist movements that would follow. The injustices faced by women heightened social awareness. Silent acts of resistance, escape attempts, and subtle strategies functioned as sparks within a broader historical context. The hardships endured by women inspired subsequent generations to draw attention to these issues and to initiate struggles for rights. By the late 19th century in England, feminist movements advocating for women's access to education, property rights, and the right to vote emerged as a direct response to these historical injustices. Scandals and tragedies of the period sparked debates across different segments of society. The press and literature played a crucial role in making women's suffering visible. Novels, newspapers, and personal diaries depicted the helplessness of women and the pressures of their constrained lives, raising public consciousness. Women writers and activists used these works to highlight both individual stories and broader societal problems. Economic and social transformations also had long-term effects. Women's lack of economic independence reinforced power imbalances within families and society. Over time, however, industrialization and urbanization created opportunities for women to enter the workforce and gain financial autonomy. Their participation in economic life challenged the patriarchal mindset that reduced them to property and initiated a broader process of social change. Legal reforms gradually followed. Laws that had restricted women's rights in the Victorian era began to change slowly toward the end of the 19th century. Women increasingly gained a voice in inheritance, marriage, and divorce proceedings. These legal transformations can be seen as a reaction to the long-term consequences of the era's oppressive practices and systemic inequalities. Social change was also fueled by the growth of collective consciousness among women. By forming networks of solidarity, women learned to fight together for their lives and rights. This cooperation laid the groundwork for later feminist movements and strengthened women, saw a capacity to make their voices heard and challenge inequality. In conclusion, the selling of wives and the treatment of women as property in the Victorian era represented a tragic and dark aspect of the period. Yet these tragedies ultimately heightened societal awareness, paved the way for legal and economic reforms, and laid the foundation for the women's rights movement. The suffering, silent resistance, and strategic maneuvers of women provided inspiration for future generations in their struggle for freedom and equality. This chapter demonstrates that the Victorian era was not only a period of darkness, but also the beginning of a challenging yet impactful process that led to social transformation. The tragedies and resilience of women transformed the darkest pages of history into the roots of contemporary struggles for equality and liberty.